Welcome everyone to the Small is Bountiful webinar. My name is Ratana Chinpakdi of the Too Big to Ignore Global Partnership for Small-Scale Fisheries. I am speaking to you from St. John's, Newfoundland in Canada. The event is organized as part of the World Oceans Day 2020 to celebrate the importance and contribution of small-scale fisheries to ocean sustainability and innovation. We are emphasizing small-scale fisheries in the discussion about ocean sustainability because small-scale fisheries are not only too big to ignore, but they are also too important to fail. The event of this scale cannot happen without the effort of many people. I would like to acknowledge all the partner organizations, team members and staff, students and volunteers, as well as our funders for the wonderful support. Here's a webinar program for this week, which covers important topics about small-scale fisheries that needs to be discussed. Starting from today's topic related to the impact of COVID-19 on small-scale fisheries, followed by the discussion about how to implement Sustainable Development Goal 14B, which is related to the access to resources and markets for small-scale fisheries. Recognizing that small-scale fisheries are connected to communities and other sectors of the society, on Wednesday, we will explore the nexus between small-scale fisheries and other SDGs. On Thursday, we will hear about the SSF guidelines and how to implement them using the human rights-based approach. Finally, on Friday, we will talk about blue justice and the need to consider social justice and equity for small-scale fisheries in sustainable ocean development. On June 8th, which is the World Oceans Day, we would have 24 hours around the world celebration, starting with a panel session with colleagues in Australia and the Pacific Islands to talk about the exciting work that they are doing, followed by a panel session about the situation in South and Southeast Asia, particularly related to COVID-19 and other risks and vulnerability that they're dealing with. The next session would focus on how small-scale fisheries are doing in Africa with diverse voices from the continent. The next 5 sessions on June 8th will be on the same topics as the webinar this week, but this time the sessions are organized as panel discussion to focus on innovation and opportunities for small-scale fisheries as we move forward, especially in the post-COVID world. The last 2 sessions on June 8th will focus on the situation of small-scale fisheries in the Gulf and the Caribbean and in Latin America at the time of COVID-19 and beyond. The last session of the day would be in Spanish. We hope that you will join us during this week-long program and contribute your idea about what we can do together to support and promote sustainable small-scale fisheries and situate them more centrally in the discussion about ocean sustainability. Your contribution will be part of the recommendations that we put together for the planning of the next Ocean Conference and for the preparation of the International Year of Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture in 2022. Bienvenidos a webinar Lo Pequeño es Abundante. La sesión va a ser en inglés, pero puede seguirlo en español haciendo clic en el enlace de Google Doc. Usted también puede hacer preguntas en español en el chat y nosotros lo traduciremos por usted. Okay, so today I am also sharing this session on COVID-19 and really bring attention to people of the small-scale fisheries and also what happened in terms of the impact, adaptation, how they have been responding to the crisis and also innovation that have been taking place. This session is organized by a number of partners, including Comunidad y Biodiversidad, that's COBI, Blue Ventures, Local Catch Network, Future of Fish, University of Aveiro, Linea de Agua Foundation, ICSF, GCFI, OFI, and TBTI. I would now introduce the speakers for today. This is Marianne Manuel. She's the Assistant Director of Dakshin Foundation, based in India, and she coordinates Dakshin's COVID response efforts to support fish workers across the Indian coast. Welcome to the Small is Bountiful event, Marianne.
Thank you, Ratna.
Next, we have Jenny Oates, who is the Knowledge Development Manager at Blue Ventures, based in the UK. She's been synthesizing information from Blue Ventures field sites on the impacts of the COVID-19 on small-scale fisheries. Hello, Jenny.
Hi, Ratna. Hi, everybody.
The third speaker is Cristina Pita, who is a senior researcher at Center of Environmental and Marine Studies and the University of Aveiro in Portugal. So Cristina is leading an initiative to investigate the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on small-scale fisheries, and will be sharing with us what she learned about the situation in Europe.
Hello, Ratna. Hello, everybody.
Next, we have Josh Stoll, who is an assistant professor of marine policy in the School of Marine Science at the University of Maine. He's been doing research on coastal community resilience, seafood distribution, ocean governance, and fisheries policy, and will share with us his experience about what's happening in the US. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you.
Finally, we would have our last speaker would be Marianne Manuel, who is a Conservation and Fisheries Program Director at Comunidad y Biodiversidad, COBI, based in Mexico. So she's leading a large-scale study looking at how COVID-19 affects small-scale fisheries in over there. So as you will see, welcome, Maria Jose.
Thank you, Ratana. Welcome, everyone.
Okay, great. So thanks so much for all of you to come on to the program today as a kickoff for this exciting week. And so you see that I would start my presentation to speak a little bit about what we have been doing from here, and then we'll invite you to come back to share your stories. So right now, I'm just gonna remove you from the screen momentarily. So I'm just trying to make my screen a little bit bigger. Okay, so I wanted to just start by looking at presenting basically what it means since we started the COVID-19 situation around the world and how that affects how we do research. And I wanted to say this simply because it has brought some very important opportunity for us. Oh, sorry, I should say something about our chat moderator before I begin my presentation. So your audience, you definitely are welcome to put questions on the chat box on YouTube that we see. And we have a chat box moderator, Charles Steinbeck, who's Director of Business Development of Future of Fish, who would then be able to bring those questions to the panel. We also have our Spanish moderator chat box, So by now you might see some of the Spanish text that is happening on that chat box. So feel free to write the question in Spanish, and then we'll translate that and put it back into English for us. So if you want to follow in Spanish, of course, you can go to the Google Doc and have the summary there. Okay, so back to my presentation. Basically, we wanted to talk about how COVID has changed how we do research. And this is, I would consider this a major opportunity. So I'm presenting this on behalf of a very big team who have been working for the Too Big to Ignore Global Partnership for Small-Scale Fisheries, and also with the Ocean Frontier Institute governance module, are the two projects that I'm leading at the moment. Generally, we have a few people working on different topics that are related to small-scale fisheries and ocean governance. So this is basically the list of people who I've been working with to trying to figure it out what's been happening to small-scale fisheries. But since the COVID-19 started and we could no longer go into the field, we decided that we would channel our funding through the support from our funders, in this case, Oak Foundation and Canada Research Excellence Fund, to, the funding to the OFI project. And then we hired a large group of students. So the list that you see here on the screen are the students who we have from around the world. They are international students who are affected by COVID-19. None of them knew anything about small-scale, about fisheries or small-scale fisheries, but we have asked them to help us doing this desk research to find new stories about what's happening to small-scale fisheries around the world. And basically, with the help, with their work, the help that I have been doing, we are able to cover in 1 month 178 stories. And they are from 100 media sources, both in printed and radio and TV. So because we're here in Canada, we have a bit more stories happening, especially in Newfoundland. But it's a pretty good coverage that we have been able to do. And the kind of things that we see in the headline news are something like these when we talk about who are affected by COVID-19 when it comes to fisheries. Basically, it's commercial fisheries, but also artisanal fisheries, small-scale fisheries, processors, fish workers, even farmers, people who live in the community. So these are the kind of headline news that we see. When it comes to how they are affected, these are basically the word cloud of the keywords that comes up. A lot to do with vulnerabilities, access, markets. People talk about food. There's a local health, operational health, and a lot of safety issue as well. And some of the stories might be biased because of the access that we have to the news stories. We don't have students covering all languages, so we don't know what's going on, and that's why you would hear really real stories from our other speakers. But it is telling some stories, right, in terms of the kind of impacts that we are seeing. We categorize these impacts into 5 main categories. First, it's about access to resources and markets. So you see that in blue. So in all 5 continents, every small-scale fisheries are affected in terms of access to resources and markets. The second category, it's about operational health and safety. So those are the orange part in the donuts, and that's in some cases, like in Europe, that seems to be, there's a lot of stories there also in North America. The third category, it's about recruitment, training, and retention. So there's not a lot of stories about that yet, but at least in Newfoundland, we talk a lot about that. The same with, the vulnerability and viability, that's that donut in green. That section seems to come up a lot as well in all cases. And I skipped one, which is perception, values, and knowledge. That is a very hard category to capture, but we wanted to look at that. And I think that's partly because it's a little bit, a little bit difficult to be talking about those topics at the moment, because the immediate one are about access to resources and markets, and also how small-scale fishing people are vulnerable to the change that's happening because of COVID-19, and also the issues with operational health and safety. But it does tell very good stories about what's going on around the world. So these are basically our main observations, just again based on the desk study research that the international students that we're hiring during this time to help us come up with. So definitely major changes in markets, lots of closures, both international and domestic. Some people have been gaining because of that, but many have lost because of that. We have seen some innovative solutions, including direct sales in some cases, but there's still a lot more that need to be done. So definitely we're seeing major impacts on operational health and safety, particularly because of physical distancing restriction, and then access to resources itself, because you're not allowed to go fishing in some cases. But in general, we don't think there's enough attention yet, or any kind of support that has been given to help small-scale fisheries at this time. Some places do better than others, but generally speaking, there's still a lot more that needs to be done. And surprisingly to us, there's not a lot of cover about women, but our speakers that come up after this would probably have a lot of examples to share when it comes to that situation. And then, of course, we know that at least 16 organizations that we follow their stories are really doing very excellent jobs at providing support, especially financial aid and other kinds of support to small-scale fisheries, but they are still working at immediate needs at the moment. So we really would like to see more conversation, especially when we go into June 8th panel discussion about what we need to do as we're ending this COVID-19 in very soon, hopefully. So that's it from me, and I would like to thank again to Canada First Research Excellence Fund, Oak Foundation, and Memorial University for making this research possible. Thank you, everyone. So now I would bring our first speaker, Marianne Manuel, back to the screen, and I would then go to the deck, and I let you share your screen. Well, let me make sure that you're able to share your screen. So
okay, 1 second.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're ready to go, Marianne?
Yes, I am.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, good evening, everyone. So my name is Marianne. I'm the Assistant Director of an NGO here in India called Dakshin Foundation. And so today I'm going to be just talking about what's been happening with SSF communities here in India. So India is currently in the 10th week of a national lockdown, which is part of our government's strategy to combat COVID-19. 5 days ago, India became one of the 10 countries worst affected by the pandemic. And we're also ranked 4th in the number of cases that are increasing on a daily basis. So despite the restrictions in mobility that all of us are facing here in India, we can see that civil society organizations, so NGOs and citizens, have actually played a critical role in providing support during this time. For instance, my colleagues and I at Dakshin are currently isolating in our homes in Karnataka. That's the state of here. But we're handling cases across all these different states that you can see highlighted in green. And this is made possible actually only because of the existing national networks in India and the members of these networks coming together to identify and support these groups in distress, irrespective of what states they're in. So what I'll be sharing in today's presentation is what we have learned over the course of these 2 months from talking to communities, organizations, and government officials as part of our efforts to support SSF communities and stranded migrant fish workers. Before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about the inherent vulnerability of India's SSF community. So what makes this group in general a vulnerable group? So for one, coastal spaces in India are highly contested spaces, we're seeing an increase in dispossession of SSF communities from coastal commons, driven by the country's commodification of the coast that we're seeing as part of India's blue economy vision, facilitated by dilution in environmental regulations here in India. This, combined with the depletion of nearshore fisheries because of pollution, environmental degradation, fishing down food webs, has seen a steady migration of communities, of individuals from SSF to other livelihoods. This includes working as crew members on mechanized vessels and being part of allied fishing industries as well, allied activities. We're also seeing an increased government focus on different forms of industrial aquaculture and mariculture to meet seafood demands both nationally and for exports. So coming to the lockdown and its impact on SSF communities. So in the evening of 24th March, our Prime Minister announced that there would be a nationwide lockdown starting the next day. Because of the sudden nature of the announcement, and the fact that it was unclear to us whether fishing and fisheries in general was exempt from the lockdown and exactly what the protocol for this exemption was, it meant that fishing across the country ground to a standstill. And what we saw was varying impacts on the different actors, but focusing on SSF, to begin with, if you look at fishers and fish vendors of the community, we see that because of their dependence on daily income to support their families, the lockdown and the inability to go fishing meant that they were spending their meager savings on food for their families. So I'm just going to play a short clip here. So these are women from Orissa and Tamil Nadu that Dakshin, along with the National Fishworker Forum, UAA, and Sneha, have been gathering stories from to publicize what Ratna just said, the invisibility of the fishing community at this time, but specifically also women within the community. So if you go to our social media pages, you will see these stories from different coastal states in India. And all of them will tell you about the hunger, the exclusion from government aid, and the kind of looming destitution that these communities are currently faced with. So I'd refer you back to these videos for more information about what's happening with these groups. Coming to the question of migrant fish workers, as I said, members of the SSF community have been migrating to different states to participate in either mechanized fishing or in allied activities. But the mechanized sector in India is not just dependent on these fishing communities, it also includes a lot of non-fishing communities that take up less skilled work. So if you look at, for instance, this graphic is just an illustration based of some of the data from the cases that we've been handling. So if you look at Karnataka, for instance, you will see that there are migrants from the states of Tamil Nadu and Odisha, which are here, which are coastal states. But there are also migrants from the state of Bihar, which is not a coastal state. So these fish workers, when the lockdown was announced, found themselves stranded either on boats, which was anchored offshore, or at the harbors, unable to return to their homes or access adequate food, drinking water, and sanitation. So this video, just to give you a sense of what these harbors look like, it's from Veraval Harbor, which is in the state of Gujarat. It's one of the largest mechanized harbors in India. So to give you a scale of the number of boats that we're talking about, and each of these vessels has about 15 to 20 people on board. And so these workers have been in these conditions for over a month. And recently, in the last few weeks, we've seen some relaxations in transport restrictions. But what that has meant is that these workers are now paying exorbitant prices to hire vehicles to take them by road back to their native states. And from what we've seen, the money for this is coming largely from what they're able to borrow. Either what their families back home are borrowing from money lenders and sending it to them, or what they're borrowing from boat owners against the future wages. So in a sense, they're entering into a contract to come back and work on the same boats without wages once the fishing season resumes post the lockdown. So overall, what we've seen is that irrespective of exactly what their role within the fishery sector is, the SSF community has been left vulnerable to higher levels of indebtedness, a lack of livelihoods, and an inability to support their families, which has also meant lower levels of nutrition and health. So what has this meant for fisheries governance in India? So understandably, because of the scale of the issue, civil society organizations, national platforms, the communities themselves have been looking to the government to pass orders and regulations that would mitigate this situation. But letters from all of these groups has received a mixed response from the government. On the surface, the government response indicates a receptiveness to these alerts. And you can see, for instance, in this image that the government order refers back to letters that they've received from different groups. And then within 15 days of the lockdown, possibly as a result of these letters, the government issued an order that clarified that fishing and fishing operations was exempt from the lockdown. But by this time, the supply chain had collapsed, and essentially reinitiation of fisheries required more from the government than simply permitting it to continue. Since then, we've seen other government orders, such as the reduction in our annual monsoon fishing ban, an announcement of an economic stimulus package to the fisheries sector. But closer analysis of these orders shows that they do little to address the actual impacts of the lockdown on the community, or even the pre-lockdown vulnerability that I referred to. So instead, these orders seem to be motivated by the same capitalistic agendas that existed before the lockdown and push the SSF further into the margins. So for instance, the economic package that was announced last week was merely a reiteration of the earlier budget. Investments largely went towards aquaculture and supply chain infrastructure. The fishing community's demand for an economic package, a compensation package that would compensate for the losses they incurred during the lockdown, was not a part of this, was not a part of the budget announcement. In terms of civil society and governance, the biggest lesson for all of us during this has been the power of networks. So information gathering, identifying groups in distress, successfully getting the state to issue clarifications and guidelines. All of this would not have been possible if not for the existing network of NGOs and fisher unions here in India. And equally clear is that we do need to network across interest groups. So labor rights needs to meet fishing rights, needs to meet groups working on migrant rights. Given that government efforts resemble disaster capitalism a lot more closely than genuine aid, we need to take these partnerships forward to build a wider collaboration and support for SSF issues here in India. From the angle of rural poverty, one strategy that we've found that makes a small contribution to tackling this issue is to ensure that the funds that are going to relief efforts for fishing communities also circulate through the wider local economy. So for example, Dakshin has been raising funds to support UAA and Sneha with their relief efforts in Odisha and Tamil Nadu. And these organizations have ensured that the supplies for their relief kits come from local women's cooperative societies, producer groups, small businesses, and even trusts, charitable trusts, which means that the funds that we are raised for fishing communities circulates in the general economy, but also feeds back into other charitable initiatives in the area. The other thing to quickly mention is that we have seen an increase in online retail options spring up. And if this becomes the new normal post the lockdown, it would have a significant impact on the women of the SSF community who play the role of fish vendors, and essentially make this role almost obsolete. So that is also a challenge that one needs to keep in mind going forward. Yeah, so I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marianne, for that, which is just I don't know why you disappear from the camera, by the way, so hope you can get back later. Now I will invite Jenny. And Jenny is ready, so I would go back now. Please, Jenny.
So good morning, afternoon or evening, everybody, depending on where you are. My name is Jenny Oates from Blue Ventures, and I'm going to be giving a summary of the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis on small-scale fisheries in Africa, specifically focusing on the Western Indian Ocean, which is where Blue Ventures do a lot of our work. I apologise if you hear my cat meowing in the background. It's around lunchtime here in the UK, and I think she might have heard that we were talking about fish. So yes, if you hear any strange noises, that's probably her. But yeah, just to give you an overview of my presentation, I'm going to start off with an introduction to Blue Ventures, and then spend most of the presentation talking about some of the observations that we've seen from our field sites across East Africa of the impacts of the COVID crisis on small-scale fisheries. And then I'll finish by talking about some of the solutions and responses that we've already seen that hopefully could provide some hope for the future. Blue Ventures is a UK-based marine conservation organisation dedicated to rebuilding tropical fisheries with coastal communities. We originally started working in Madagascar, and now we have field teams in Belize and Timor-Leste, as well as working with partners across East Africa, India and Indonesia. All of these areas across the tropics contain huge marine biodiversity and very important marine ecosystems, which are under threat from overfishing and habitat destruction, and these are only accentuated by the effects of climate change. But small-scale fishing communities in these areas face several constraints to managing their marine resources. They're all facing extreme poverty, reliance on fishing, limited access to healthcare and education, lack of experience of community organisation, and a lack of recognition of small-scale fishers' rights. In the context of these challenging circumstances, the COVID-19 crisis has had serious impacts on the communities in these areas. Blue Ventures has been collecting observations from our field teams who work across different countries in East Africa, as well as our partner organisations, and I'm going to provide a summary of the impacts and responses that we've seen so far. Across East Africa, tourism has stopped due to the restrictions on global transport, which has led to a lower demand for seafood in hotels and restaurants. This has meant that fishers are having to sell their catches locally into domestic markets. And due to the surplus of supply, fish prices have generally fallen. So fishing generally continues, but fishers are making much less money for their catches. To give you a few examples from some of the countries that we work in Kenya, the government are providing some financial support to fishers and hoping to procure some solar dryers to preserve fish until the markets recover. There's also been an increase in fishing effort in Kenya, but less poaching in no-take zones due to the nighttime curfew that's in place there. In Tanzania, the price of sugar and other household products has increased. And most migrant fishers who are based on the island of Songo have shifted to the mainland due to the severe declines in fish prices. In Comoros, prior to this crisis, there was very little tourism and export of seafood anyway, so local markets have generally been unaffected, but the nighttime curfew in place there has stopped reef cleaning at nighttime. And in Mozambique, the demand for big fish has decreased due to the severe impact on the tourist industry there and less demand in hotels and restaurants. I'm now going to move on to some specific observations from our field sites in Madagascar. In Madagascar, fewer collectors are buying seafood, but this is mainly due to the decline in global export markets rather than tourism, as there's not as much tourism in Madagascar and it's only in some small areas. So as a consequence, similar to elsewhere in East Africa, most of the catch is for local consumption, and fish prices remain low in local markets. This has meant that there's been a severe drop in household income for those communities who are dependent on small-scale fisheries, and people are unable to afford to buy food. Interestingly though, there is a collector in Manturano on the west coast of Madagascar who started exchanging fish for rice and oil instead of money. So that's been very helpful to communities there. So overall in Madagascar, there's generally been less fishing and some changes in the types of fishing to focus on the demand. But in some areas, people are returning from the cities where they've been unable to work to return to their families on the coast in order to fish. It's important to mention as well that sea cucumber and seaweed farming are still continuing, and these are important sources of income for those families that are unable to get good prices for fish. And we've also seen more infractions, including illegal mangrove cutting and illegal fishing. And it's important to note that what we've seen are general trends, and the impacts do vary according to different regions and different fish species. And the reason that we've been able to have all of this information is that Blue Ventures data collectors are now able to work in all the areas where there is fishing, and that's using personal protective equipment provided by Blue Ventures. So to summarize, even though the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis itself have not been that significant yet at this point across East Africa, the communities have been heavily affected by the impact on the markets. And the crisis has shown how heavily reliant these communities are on fishing, and particularly on specific supply chains, which leaves these communities vulnerable to shocks. In Madagascar, we've been fortunate enough to be able to continue our alternative livelihood programs, such as seaweed and sea cucumber aquaculture. There are still markets for these products, and they're still getting good prices. So this gives communities some resilience to this kind of economic shock. We also had previously set up savings and loans groups, which have continued throughout the crisis, giving communities some financial resilience as well. And another alternative livelihood is marine ecotourism. And although this can be a great source of income, tourism itself has been heavily affected by the restrictions on travel during this crisis. So that emphasizes the need to have a range of options for alternative livelihoods and not just be dependent on one source of income. So if you're interested to find out more about the observations that we have made on the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis on small-scale fishing communities, there's lots more information on the COVID-19 resources page on the Blue Ventures website, as well as links to a lot of other resources and information from partner organisations. So please have a look at that if you'd like to know more. So to summarise, I've shown that the key impacts that we've observed across East Africa have mainly been due to the reliance on the global export market for seafood products, in particular fish. But potentially in future, diversification towards other products and more local markets could provide more resilience to future shocks. Thank you very much for listening, and in particular, thank you to all of the field staff from Blue Ventures for providing this information. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jenny, for that. Very interesting to hear. Now, I would invite the next speaker. That will be Christina Pita. And Christina, when you're ready, you can share your screen.
Okay, I am ready. There we go. Can you see my screen? I hope so. Hello, everyone. I will be presenting some preliminary results from a study about the impacts of COVID-19 on small-scale fisheries in Europe. Small-scale fisheries are an important component of European fisheries. They account for 82% of the fleet in numbers, 47% of employment, and 14% of the value of landings. Very importantly, they provide EU markets with fresh, high-quality seafood luxury seafood to restaurants and hotels, and many are highly dependent on these channels to sell their catch. In order to investigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the unprecedented lockdowns that we've seen in Europe to fight the pandemic on small-scale fishers, we conducted a survey to collect information from representatives of small-scale fishers organizations. We did interviews done over the phone, kind of on opportunistic, contacted colleagues all over Europe that had direct contacts with organizations and did them over the phone, to ask these representatives organizations about the social economic impacts of COVID-19 on small-scale fishers activity, the impacts on health and well-being, and the measures they've adopted to face this crisis. So far, we have collected information from representatives of 105 organizations in 12 different countries, but we are still waiting for more replies. We asked specifically about the economic loss, direct and indirect economic loss. And we asked them to identify this on a scale. They identified important losses in revenue, classifying it as a 7 on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 was no loss to 10, very high loss. The representatives of organizations specifically mentioned losses between 20 and 100%, depending on the species. The loss was especially high in Northern Europe, with reports of losses of 80 to 100% in the case of shellfish. Fishers targeting high-value species, besides shellfish, suffered quite an important economic loss all over Europe. In terms of employment, the impact was not so high. Some fishers are in layoff, some working for less pay, up to 50% less pay in one of the cases, was reported in a country in Northern Europe. And some were sent in vacations. The representatives of the organizations pointed to the fact that small-scale fishers are mostly a family business, hence the low loss in jobs, but that the industry is used to stop for long periods of time due to bad weather. But if this persists over a long period of time, then there will be a loss of jobs in the near future. Besides revenue and jobs, we also asked representatives of organizations to classify a series of drivers of social economic impacts on a scale of 1 to 10, from not important at all to very high importance. So they had some statements and they had to classify them. We observed a difference in replies between northern and southern representatives of organizations, with the southern ones considering the loss of usual customers like restaurants and schools, the loss of markets due to the absence of tourism, the decrease in prices at auction, and the lack of buyers at auction as the main reasons for the social economic impacts they were observing. While in the north, the main drivers for these social economic impacts were a decrease in prices, the loss of international markets, the loss of markets due to the absence of tourism, and the loss of usual customers. If we look in more detail at the top main reasons, the loss of usual customers was connected to the closure of the HoReCa channels and the shift in the consumer demand from fresh to frozen canned seafood, with the major supermarket chains becoming the biggest fishmongers in the most European countries, and people more interested in buying not so perishable goods like frozen or canned. The loss of markets due to the absence of tourism is clearly connected to the previous closure of the food service industry. People interviewed pointed that the cancellation of seafood festivals over the coming summer will be a major future impact on income of fishermen, and we can, in the south of Europe especially, can represent a lot of income because there is a lot of festivals over the summer period, seafood festivals. The loss of international markets was a problem commonly mentioned by northern representatives, especially the loss of the Spanish, Italian, and French markets. Some of the countries that were more affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, were also the major markets for seafood exports. And they point to the fact that the local buyers don't have the capacity to replace these markets. The local market does not have the capacity to replace, and the local buyers don't have the capacity to buy and sell internally. The decrease in prices at auction, especially for luxury seafood, was pointed as a major problem for small-scale fisheries, with no one buying these products at auction at the moment. Impacts are not just socioeconomic, so we also asked them about impacts on health and well-being. And in this case, it is interesting to see that there were no major differences between the replies from southern or northern representatives of small-scale fisheries organizations, with all pointing to the need to take care of the family, fears about the virus, and shortage of personal protective equipment as the major impacts on their health and well-being. Looking in more detail at these top three replies, the older vulnerable fishers are staying home due to being at higher risk, while younger fishermen are staying home to take care of their children, especially if their wives work in more steady jobs, so jobs not related to the fishing industry. So then these younger fishermen are deciding to stay home for childcare instead of their wives, because they have a more steady source of income. There are also fears about the virus, as vessels are confined spaces. Some referring that the problem is not really on the sea, but more on landing sites, where a lot of people come together, and it's difficult to maintain a distance. They also point to difficulty complying with social distancing on board and at auction sites, and the difficulty accessing personal protective equipment. This has changed probably a bit over the past 1 week, with more personal protective equipment in the market, in Europe at least. Finally, we asked representatives about the measures they have adopted to face the crisis. So this is not a scale anymore, it's asking them about the effective measures they've put in place to face the crisis. And differences were observed between northern and southern representatives of organizations, between their replies. The ones in the north mentioning that they had put in place changes in fishing efforts, requested national financial aid, and selling directly to consumers, while in the north, most of the measures passed by requesting financial aid and selling directly to final consumers. Looking a bit in more detail into it, it's interesting to see that despite having already applied for the financial aid, small-scale fishers point to the difficulties accessing these funds, that the application process is very bureaucratic, and it's a bit of a turn-off, with some preferring not to apply for this fund because of the extreme bureaucracy. The direct selling to consumers has been a successful solution to many fishers. There is an increase on online selling. Fish box schemes won more clients in several parts around Europe. And in some cases, fishers are even selling door-to-door. Fishers that were not involved in fish box schemes started selling door-to-door in the south of Europe. Changes in fishing efforts have occurred, especially in the south, in order to match demand. In the north, this was pointed as a difficulty, not such an easy thing to do, because the rules do not allow fishermen to change target species. Fishers are also fishing less due to the lower demand and decrease in fish prices at auction. So this was a short presentation. There's some very preliminary results. We're still working on it. I would like to especially thank this. This is a big effort. Although I'm presenting the work, this is a big effort from a long list of people, especially the project co-coordinators, Sebastian Vilazante and Jose Pascual, and the long list of co-authors who have collected the information on their respective countries. I would like to finish by thanking them all, and including the representatives of organizations who replied to the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina. So now we have heard from about the situation in Asia and then Africa and now Europe. So I would like to now invite George to speak to the situation in the US. When you're ready, George, please share your screen. And yeah.
Thank you, Ratana. And it's a privilege to be part of this conversation today. Hello to everyone who is joining us via YouTube and Facebook for this important discussion. As Ratana noted early, my name is Joshua Stoll, and I'm faculty in the School of Marine Sciences at the University of Maine. This conversation so far is a reminder to me that not only is this an extraordinarily challenging situation, but our sort of ability as individuals and communities to cope with this are so deeply rooted in sort of structural and historical inequalities that exist. So I just want to acknowledge that up front. My comments today are mostly focused on the North American context, and in particular, draw on insights from my experience working with and learning from the local catch network. The local catch network was established in 2011 and is a community of practice made up of fishermen and women, community organizations, researchers, and technical assistance providers from across North America who are engaged in and working to support healthy fisheries and communities that depend on them through community-supported fisheries and other direct producer-to-consumer models. The network now has more than 500 members and is supported by an 8-member executive committee with backbone support from the North American Marine Alliance and the University of Maine through my research lab. COVID-19 in the US and Canada, we began to see the health impacts of the crisis of the pandemic in mid-March, and it has disrupted every aspect of life, including our food systems. The impacts to small-scale fisheries here in the US and Canada have been highly variable due to the seasonality of fisheries, due to their differential ties to global markets, and to the characteristics of the product themselves, fresh versus frozen, processed versus whole, and the end use for consumption versus bait, whether it's wild capture or aquaculture. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the impacts have been evolving quickly and are changing as they move through the supply chain from harvester to consumer. And therefore, the impacts are not just on the water, as we've heard, but also in the processing sector and sales, distribution, and communities more broadly. One of the major changes that we have observed in the US and elsewhere due to stay-at-home orders and social distancing is a change in how consumers are purchasing food. This is a point that I will return to later, but this data from the US Farm Bureau shows an evolution where we see a major transition from buying of food through food services, restaurants, and other institutions to grocery stores and more direct-to-consumer outlets. I think there are a lot of different ways that we can understand the impacts that are being felt in the US and Canada in small-scale fisheries. The case of the elver or glass eel fishery here in Maine, where I'm based, provides an illustrative example, both of the diverse types of impacts, as well as how they've changed through time. This fishery is persecuted through a fyke net and dip net fish, using fyke net and dip net methods, and it occurs in early spring on the banks of tidal rivers across the state of Maine. In 2019, this was the second most valuable fishery in the state at over $20 million. And of particular note, this fishery is of extreme economic importance to tribal representatives that make up the Wabanaki Confederacy. As you can see here from this series of newspaper clippings, you see this sort of evolution in the impacts that are observed. The first impact in mid-March is that the fishery was delayed by fisheries managers. The fishery then shortly after that gets started, but along with that, there's a series of new management regulations that require health and protection measures to ensure there isn't a spread of the virus. And then later, as the fishery ramps up, we see that there's a major drop in price. This fishery has historically been extremely high value, with prices up to $2,000 US per pound. We see those dropping down to about $500. One of the things that we've been doing in collaboration with Coastal Routes, which is a collaboration based out of the University of Guelph, is documenting the way in which small-scale operators in North America are responding to COVID and these impacts. And these are documented through a series of podcasts called Social Fishencing. I want to play a clip here that shares three people's perspectives, because I think as we think about the impacts and the ways in which people are adapting, the voices that we hear are extremely important. So hopefully this audio works. Okay, I'm hearing that the audio isn't working, so I apologize for that. I would encourage everyone to take a few minutes out of their day to listen to the stories that are coming directly from harvesters, because I think it captures a depth that often gets lost in the higher level analyses. In addition to so in response to the various impacts that we've seen, there have been a number of types of social protections and investments made to support small-scale operators. Some of that have come through federal and government support. Here is a list of them here. For the sake of time, I want to point out that most of these are responsive and aim to be or are short-term in nature. But there are several that may have longer-term impacts. One of those is at a state level, where we start to see the change in types of licenses to allow people to sell directly off their sales. Directly off their docks. We're also seeing responses in the private sector and within nonprofit organizations, things like Facebook pages to help connect consumers to fishermen, national surveys looking at impacts, educational materials to help consumers better understand how to use and consume seafood. online forums and resources, many webinars, new seafood finders, and lists of vendors who are selling seafood. Really focused on how do you connect consumers directly to harvesters. And while many of these are also short-term, some of these approaches have a longer-term view. So one of the things that has been interesting, and we've heard from other speakers so far too, is that there's been a surge in the amount of interest in local and direct marketing of seafood. Through the Local Catch Network, we've seen the amount of user data, the amount of people using our site increase significantly over the last 2 months. We've seen a 300% increase in participation on the website, and CSFs and direct marketers around North America are reporting some of their strongest sales that they've ever experienced, in part because I think as consumers, one of the challenges that has come about from COVID-19 is people have realized the vulnerability of our supply chain. And so one bright spot that we're observing is consumers are wanting to find ways to connect with and support small-scale operators. And one of the ways they're doing that is through direct seafood sales. So I'll stop there and turn it back to Ratana.
Thank you very much for that, Josh. Okay, so now we have our last speaker. That would be Maria Jose. And you have your screen. And then turn on your microphone, please. Okay. So there are a lot of comments that are coming through the chat box, which is great. And some our speakers answer directly, but some we would then bring all our speakers back in order for everybody to be able to answer some of these questions that are really general and they're really great. I also see that there's a lot of interaction during between the audience and others, you know, in the chat box, which is great. Now, Maria Jose, maybe you can say something in Spanish to encourage the Spanish audience to pose questions as well, please.
Perfect. Thank you, Ratana. Bienvenidos todos a nuestra sesión, nuestra primera sesión de COVID. En esta plática vamos a revisar cuál es el update de Latinoamérica y de las pesquerías de pequeña escala. Thank you for joining the first session of this ocean event. Thank you, TBTI, for inviting us. And here I'm gonna present an update of the COVID situation in Latin America and the impacts on SSFL. Just to give you the update, we have the 16% of the cases of COVID if we count from last February to date. And as we can see in this figure, in the dark blue, these are the cases of Latin America, and we can see that the number of cases are increasing over time. And if we take into account the information that we have from yesterday, we already covered 40% of the cases recorded worldwide. Here is the list of the 10 top countries that concentrate the cases in Latin America. The first 5 are Brazil, Peru, Chile, Mexico, and Ecuador. And as you can see, Brazil and Peru also figure in the world with the 2nd and 10th place of the cases concentrated. The lockdown in Latin America started last March in most of the countries, and some of the countries are already showing control of the propagation of the virus. However, there are countries that are still showing increases in cases. The lockdown have had very important social and economic implication, and there has been debates at the national level, but also at the regional level on how to recover from COVID. Just last week, there was this session on Congress people on how to cope with COVID at the regional level, and what are the economic and social responses for each country. So at COVID, we're starting to do our virtual work since last March, and we decided to begin a consultation with Mexican small-scale fisheries and continue this consultation up until December. So we have delivered our first report last month, which was on the immediate impacts of COVID at the social and economic levels. And we are happy to say that today we are launching our second report on the role of the state in the face of COVID and from the perspective of small-scale fisheries. And when we started the consultation, we had 93 interviews, 30 communities, 43 fishing organizations, 8 coastal provinces, and 15 small-scale fisheries included. And given the response and the important information that we were getting from fishers, we really wanted to expand our coverage. And we are happy to say that we got like more fishers involved, also communities and small-scale fisheries. We are also doing social media monitoring to see responses and solutions, and it has been really interesting, and I'm gonna share some of the results. And these results, although come from the consultation by talking with our peers from Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, we are seeing similarities in the LAC region. So on the economic impacts, as it was mentioned for other regions in the LAC, we are facing market closures and price reductions. 89% of the respondents mentioned that they face market closures at the international and domestic levels. Interestingly, Fisher said that they were facing these closures before the lockdown measures in the region. Some of them in January, those that are exporting to Asia, some of them just by the beginning of March when for those that are exporting products to US and Europe. And finally, by March 20, when we did our first consultation, fishers were saying that most of the domestic markets were closed too. 48% of the fishers said that they have stopped fishing because they cannot cover the cost of fishing. 41% that they keep fishing, but with a reduction of catch, and also focusing on lower price products because the high value products are facing price reduction. So the respondents, 70% of the respondents also said that they faced price reduction from 40 to 60%, and only one fishery reported an increase of price due to its use for the pharmaceutical industry. On the social impacts, most of this community mentioned that they close the communities because they don't have sanitary equipment and health services, and the impact of having someone with COVID in the community has like very high implications. And also, as I mentioned before, fishers are selling less commercial value fish because of the price reduction. For those cooperatives that are well organized, they are supporting their members with loans and credits. And we asked them how they see their adaptation in the face of COVID, and 45% of them mentioned that they are adapting to COVID, and 44% said that they don't know how because the situation is different. It has a global implication, so it's pretty new to them. Here are the requests of small-scale fisheries. First is for their immediate needs, they need food, especially for infants and babies, and also they need cash because it's becoming scarce in communities. They need this medicine and protective equipment and information on COVID and sanitary measures. In terms of market, they want support for maintaining the price, the use of technology for opening local markets, of course, while preventing the digital exclusions to older people and those that don't have stable internet access. Also, they raise the importance of safe commercialization, given the restrictions in the communities and the high vulnerability of fishers in case they get COVID in the communities. Finally, they have mentioned that they are interested in building communication channels with the government in order to support the design and distribution of support programs, and also to improve the registries of fisheries. And at least in Mexico, there has been a lot of mentioning of consume national products, support small-scale producers, but fishers feel left out of these programs and they want to be integrated. So at COBI, we have this app, Pescadata, and where we have users that are working on FIPS, and we wanted to expand this app to connect the 300,000 fishers in Mexico. And we wanted to add some features such as a marketplace and communication channels. And COVID gave us the opportunity to accelerate the development of Pescadata. And while we are doing this, and because of the consultations we have had with fishers, we decided to start our communication channel through WhatsApp. We already have 180 fishers there sharing information on COVID, on what they are facing and solutions. And we also decided to expand once we have the Pescadata, we will migrate the group of fishers to the app, but also we want to expand the use of Pescadata to other countries. So we have had talks with our peers from Ecuador, Honduras, and Colombia to do this. And we see the opportunity of having this the use of technology to help with commercialization and bridging fishers with buyers and to share local solutions. And we also have been talking on how to connect fishers through technology to larger systems such as the ISSF. But we are not the only ones doing that. Our friends from Future of Fish have started to work with ferias online to do transactions with caletas and final consumers. They are also customizing Avalobi, which is an app used in South Africa, and they are customizing it for small-scale fisheries in Chile. In the case of Peru, they are also facilitating digital Facebook for selling and buying local fish and supporting coordination between fishers and supply chain. So we invite you to join the efforts in the LAC region and also to join the sessions that we are going to have next Monday at 7:30 p.m. and 10 p.m. And the session at 10 p.m. UTC will be in Spanish. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria Jose, for that. Just now I'm going to bring all the speakers back. So just stop sharing the screen. Yes, thank you. And now we're going to go into the question period. Like I said, there have been a lot of very active chat box here with a lot of questions already. So, I mean, we covered pretty much the different situations around the world of how small-scale fisheries are impacted by this COVID-19, and also, you know, the different responses. And I wanted to start from this one question from the audience. Naveen basically, you know, asked, what additional vulnerabilities, many of you already mentioned, right, that small-scale fisheries already are in a precarious situation. So the COVID situation is really making things a lot worse, perhaps in many cases. So just wanted to get that general conversation going first before we go into any specific. Do you really see that the exposure to the COVID-19 is really making small-scale fishing communities much more vulnerable than before in the cases that you have been looking at? Go ahead, Jenny.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thanks, Naveen. Certainly from the experiences of the countries in which Blue Ventures work, we've really seen that in the same way as other situations could cause economic shocks, such as extreme weather systems, hurricanes, so on, causing damages to coastal communities, the COVID-19 crisis has really exposed some vulnerabilities, I think, of this sector. And in particular, I think we've noticed the dependence on, as you say, global export markets, but also specific supply chains for specific products, making communities very vulnerable to this kind of economic shock. And so I think that's something to think about for the future, that these vulnerabilities could cause problems if there were other shocks in future. So yeah, trying to move more towards wider types of products and also potentially more local, regional or national supply chains as opposed to global supply chains, I think would help.
Okay, so in that context, I mean, I'm going to invite others to speak as well, but I also want to also pose this context that came from Samir, and that's kind of, I'm not sure whether it's just specific to Bangladesh or not, but basically we have this situation as well, right? That, there might be different types of fishing people, like in this case, the migrant fishers. So the question that came from Samir is like, how do you address this fisher folk identity? Are there any protection to the most vulnerable? So perhaps in other speakers, if you wanted to add, the kind of vulnerability situation given this context as well, that'd be great. Marianne, you want to start there? Maybe
sure. I mean, going back to Naveen's question also, I think one thing that's clear is how little we understand labor in general in the fisheries sector and migration. And also the apathy of the government in terms of providing social security to SSF communities, directed relief measures. And to answer Samia's question as well, the relief measures currently in India, for instance, are addressing poor, and there's criteria to categorize an individual as poor, and you get a card. And a lot of the fishing community in general can't meet that criteria. They're not able to provide the documentation needed to be considered eligible for these schemes. And so that means that in India, you see SSF excluded from a lot of the official government relief measures, and you see the dependence on civil society actually to step in and support these communities. And similar to what Jenny mentioned, there is the dependence on export markets, and the rigidity of some of these supply chains and processes is meant that when the shutdown happened, groups weren't able to switch. So, for instance, we saw a lot of wastage in the first few days of fish being dumped into the ocean, rather than, say, a switch into presumably maybe drying the fish so that it increases the storage and can feed then into maybe local consumption or food security for rural communities. And it took a while for that transition to happen, and it still hasn't happened in many places. So we're definitely seeing a lot of things more starkly presented in the current situation.
Mm-hmm. Christina and Josh and Maria Jose, you wanted to address any of these two questions? Christina, microphone, yeah.
Yes. Maybe the first issue, which it's interesting also to see that we maybe don't think so much about this immigration issue in Europe, but there is a lot, and especially there is a lot of fishermen from Asia, and some of them, some fishermen are complaining about not being able to go back to sea right now because they don't have crew. And they don't have crew because the crew is retained in Indonesia, and because they work with a lot of Indonesians. So they can't have the crew back because there is no flights. So they can't go out to fish because they don't have crew. And this is not just in trawlers, because there's a tendency to associate this to big fishing. Also, a lot of small-scale fisheries are using foreigners as crew, and they can't get into the country. So that, well, to most European countries. So that is a problem that we've also been seeing in Europe, which goes to this issue. How little do we know really about labor in small-scale fisheries, because it's something that people probably wouldn't have thought in Europe, but it is a problem. And then I would like to reinforce, I don't know who pointed out, but I think Josh pointed out, and so did Maria Jose. It's interesting to see also this acceleration of opportunities for alternative ways of selling the catch. Also in Europe, it's obvious in the developing world, but also in Europe, we see a big dependence of small-scale fishermen, either very dependent on big on restaurants and hotels, so tourism, or very dependent on a few markets like Spain, Italy, and France.
Right.
And they export a lot. A lot of the catch is exported to these three markets. And the fact that these markets are closed has been a big problem to a lot of fishermen, of small-scale fishermen all over Europe.
So maybe I'm posting a new question here from Christopher, and I thought that would be something that Josh, perhaps you can also speak to a little bit if you happen to have that kind of examples, and also Maria Jose. Again, you know, to any of those questions, and including this new one, which is a lot to do with, you know, interventions that we see now in the supply chains. Okay. Josh, you want to speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. So I do think we've seen some interventions in the supply chain by governments and also civil society organizations. In the U.S. context, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has invested in buying seafood with the aim of helping to keep prices up and fishermen fishing. It'll be interesting to see what species those end up being and how and who benefits from that. We are also seeing at a much more small scale. We're seeing churches and things like that organize essentially buying clubs to buy directly from fishermen and fishing communities, which has been part of this shift to sort of relocalize the seafood system. We've also seen nonprofit organizations buying seafood and redistributing it to schools. There's some really interesting work that has been happening here in Maine with the lobster industry, getting lobster into schools where many of the fishermen's children have gone. And that is quite a big difference when most of that product has been getting exported around the world. And so to bring that back to communities, I think is an interesting development.
Thank you. Maria Jose, you want to add to any of these?
Yes, thank you. So in Mexico, we have had these national campaigns for domestic consumption that are being run by the government and collectives of supply chains. But it's really hard to imagine how to do that if there is not logistic plans on how to get the fish from the community when the communities are closed, and have fear to have people coming to the communities and get, you know, and so because they could get infected, and the implications of that are very high because they don't have the health services and protection equipment. So we have been pushing to start thinking on if we're gonna integrate seafood products to domestic consumption. What are the logistics? What are the safe logistics to do that? Otherwise, it's just the discourse, you know, the willingness to include them, but but we need to start thinking on the how to do that. And fishers are willing to innovate, but they have fear to be infected of COVID.
Yeah, no, that's then a great question too, because it just came from Manas, our partner here from ICSF, right? Speaking about, you know, the difficulty and the practicality of it when it comes to the requirement, like physical distancing. I know this is a case that we're talking a lot about in Newfoundland, you know, as we're learning about how to cope with this, but maybe you also have other examples as well in the cases that you covered. Anyone?
Can I add something?
Sure.
One of the things that I mentioned also, I mentioned difficulties in auction. We are finding that to be very difficult in lots of European countries, Portugal being an example. The logistics of entering the harbor, only one vessel at a time, an operation that would take probably 15 minutes in the past, half an hour, is taking 2 hours, one vessel at a time. Only one fisherman can get into the auction place. Buyers can go into the auction, but as soon as they buy, they need to leave. And all these logistics, there's already a decrease in buyers, but all these logistics makes the operation so difficult that the entire operation is very difficult. And especially bad for small-scale fishermen, because they do sell fresh products. So they need to use the auction every day. It's not just using the auction every 3 days. They need to use the auction every day. And that's the logistics of it. It's quite complicated.
Right. I guess we're going to need to save that last part, whether we should demand support when we started to bring that conversation to the June 8th session, huh? Just so that we can really think about moving ahead a little bit here. I see that some of the questions are quite specific to some of the speakers. But there is still another kind of a general question that would be interesting to discuss, and it's somewhat related to the role of researchers or other institutions in addressing the situation. This question came earlier from our colleague from Bangladesh, Mohammed. And I think that's a good way to think a little bit. We don't want this session to be only about the situation alone, but we want to think about adaptation, innovation, and moving forward. So any thought on what, you know, what we might be able to contribute to, mainly from, you know, both from the research perspective, but also other organizations that working to support small-scale fisheries. Go ahead, Jose.
So we think at COVID that is for those organizations that are doing science and are connected to small-scale fishers, it's really important to bring back the information to fishers. At least in Mexico, they were claiming for information on COVID and safety measures. So that's why we created the WhatsApp channel as a space for them to communicate. So it's like bringing back the information, bridging them and bridging them with other actors that can bring support to them.
And I would just add to that I think, as well as sharing information with small-scale fishers, I think there's a great opportunity for sharing innovation across the world, like we're doing right now, actually, and continuing to do this, taking things from the grassroots level and sharing that across the world. I think there's some great ideas coming out there that would need to be adapted for different contexts, but really could make a difference in different places as well.
Right. And we also have a comment from the audience here in terms of another way to think about this and some kind of protocols. So we would be continuing this week, right, to speak a little bit about other instruments, especially the small-scale fisheries guidelines and many other initiatives that many of us are part of that would be really good to try to promote and support. We may have time for another question, perhaps, from Sebastian. Oh, sorry, Marianne, you want to say something?
Sorry, yeah, I just wanted to add to the question on what researchers can do. And I think from what we're seeing in India and with some of the cyclones that we're facing right now, is that there is the linkage between community health and environmental health is something that doesn't get a lot of attention. And so I think this is an opportunity to really explore those linkages. And also look at what are these pathways to revive local economies the fastest, because that's really what's needed right now. A greater focus on the local and an identification of the most marginalized within also the SSF and focusing on them.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Sebastian Matthew from ICSF also sent this question to us, and I'm not sure whether we have anybody has any information to answer this question in particular. It's an interesting one, because I mean, you know, we know that the industrial fisheries are still, many of them are still ongoing, right?
Well, at least in Mexico, most of them have stopped to, because they are not allowed to go offshore. And some here in the Yucatan, there is a case where the owner of the boat said, like, no, I'm going, you know. So, but he actually did some tests to the fishers in order to recruit the crew to go offshore.
Yeah. Now, here's another interesting question. I mean, I'm just gonna do two more questions, and then we're gonna wrap this session. I know it's about 1.5 hours already, but I don't want it to miss this question. Anyone wants to address this? Coming from Anne, talking about is there any gender differentials in the implication of the pandemic? Just wanted to, you know, re-emphasize this one more time.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go first.
Okay.
You probably will have a general overview.
No, so I mean, I mentioned this towards the end of my presentation, is that a lot of the solutions are focused on fisher to customer connectivity. And what that means is it bypasses the women that have been playing such a big role in at least India's post-harvest, and I'm sure the case is there for many countries as well. And essentially, so solutions themselves also impact women and have a long-term impact on what post-COVID marketing pathways might be, and the implications for that, and an especially greater implication then on households where the primary breadwinner has been the mother, widowed households, for instance, because that means that they will take even longer to recover from this current situation.
Okay. Now, this would be the question to all of you, and you could use this opportunity to address this question and also making your final remark. We have to wrap up the session, unfortunately. So can we start from, maybe we can start from George? Anything you'd like to say to this question, and also any final remark from you?
Yeah, well, this has been a really interesting, productive conversation, so thank you for organizing it. I think one thing that I've been thinking a lot about recently relates to this idea of transformation of the marketplace. And is there a potential to think about relocalizing and creating these stronger links between harvesters and coastal communities? And I can't help but feeling like there is a bright spot there. But at the same time, I also think we're starting to see corporate entities recognizing the market potential for local and creating these sort of marketing arrangements that may undercut local and small scale operators. And I wonder what that will look like as people see this as sort of an economic opportunity to be had, and what kind of long-term implications that will have for small scale operators. So in this sort of push towards relocalizing food systems, I think there is a bright spot there, and I'm hopeful about that. But I also think we need to recognize that there's opportunities for potential manipulation there, and to marginalize small scale operators too.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Maria Jose? Yeah,
I would like to second that, and we think that can be done through technology, and we see a lot of potential in that, and we have been readjusting our work plans with communities and using like digital work, and the response has been positive. So we see a lot of potential there.
Great. Christina?
I would say that there was a mention of the issue of injustice also in Europe, and with a lot of worries from a lot of representatives of organizations about increasing the unjust access to resources and markets due to the COVID-19 pandemic, because of the type of markets that small-scale fishers target, which is HoReCa type of channels that require that require tourism, require a movement of people and hotels and restaurants, and the fact that the lockdown can persist for some time can take some of these people out of business.
That's great. Marianne?
So I think what we've seen is that the business as usual kind of attitude, which anyway marginalizes small-scale fishing communities in favor of big business and industry, has proceeded sort of full steam ahead in the pandemic. So the budget announcements, allocation of resources hasn't shifted in the least. It's been renamed as COVID response, but if you compare it, it's absolutely the same. So there is an attempt definitely to carry forward under the guise of some sort of COVID relief to communities.
And Jenny?
So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to Ratana for the opportunity to present, and thank you to everybody for listening. And in terms of my closing comments, yeah, to reiterate Marianne's thoughts, really, that I think probably one of the biggest injustices we've seen is the fact that the voice and the rights of small-scale fishers are really not being represented by governments. And I think we could take this as an opportunity to really bring their voice to the fore through showing these impacts that we're seeing, and take this opportunity to really make a difference for their future being represented in government decision making.
Thank you. Okay, so for sure there will be more sessions following today. Then many of them would actually speak to the human rights and other justice issue. So all week we would get to continue with this conversation. So I wanted to thank you everyone again for sharing your experiences and knowledge, and really wonderful work you have done. And the audience, you have been great with this active participation in the live chat box. And we wanted to make sure that if you don't mind completing the survey that should be posted at least soon in the chat box, so that way you can complete the survey, letting us know who you are, and then you can participate again tomorrow. So I would now say goodbye to everyone, and we would close with this. I'm going to remove everybody from the deck, and thank you again. And
thank you.
Hope to
thank you, bye.
Bye. Hope to see you. Oops. I would be seeing you tomorrow.